congregation sit down. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me, but I have calmed and quieted my soul, like a child quieted at his mother's breast. Like a child that is quieted is my soul. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. Here ends the lesson.
Thank you, Susan. There's something about the story of Jesus calming the storm that perplexes me. The story goes like this. As their boat is being battered by wave upon the sea, his disciples cry out to him, "We are perishing." And Jesus, it seems almost a little annoyed, responds, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" But does ultimately calm the waves and the wind. Everybody makes it out all right. What perplexes me is this. Would Jesus have calmed the storm in this way had his disciples not cried out in the way that they did? I thought of that as I meditated on our text for this week, because I think this story has something to say in dialogue with our psalm of trust. So I want you to hold that, and I'll begin this comparison just by noting the psalmist, comparing himself to a nursing infant, suggests that he has quieted his own soul. He's quieted his own soul. Let that linger too. You know, it's not uncommon to find young children as representations of profound wisdom, even unexpected power in ancient literature like the Psalms. My mind goes immediately to the Tao Te Ching, where you get a lot of this sort of imagery. The poet Lao Tzu writes, "Other people are excited as though they were at a parade. I alone don't care. I alone am expressionless, like an infant before it can smile." He also writes, "If you receive the world, the Tao will never leave you, and you will be like a little child." I don't know about you, but this kind of symbolism is something that I brought into my first reading of the psalm. Now, there is doubtlessly something remarkable about young children, maybe this one especially. Something holy even. On one level, and a profound one at that, I understand where these kinds of writings are coming from. The truth is, though, infants are the most dependent, vulnerable, helpless beings we could ever expect to associate with. And I don't think we're doing the image enough credit when we sort of whitewash it with this sheen of profundity. We should look deeply at the implications of using such an image. So turning back towards the psalm, infants get fed, but they do not feed themselves, as much as we sometimes might wish that they could. So when the psalmist compares himself to a nursing baby, explaining that he has quieted his own soul, some part of that equation seems to be missing. Now, what infants can do is express what they need, and pretty effectively. The calm of such a child is clearly a wonderful image, but what precedes it? At 9:15, it wasn't clear that the Technology was going to work, and we're glad that it does. We were all thinking crying, right? I'm sure. We were thinking that from our perspective. What precedes the baby getting calmed? He's crying. But what about from the perspective of the baby? That's the perspective we're being invited to take on by reading and meditating on this psalm. He cries because he is unable to understand the sensations even of his own body, the sensations of hunger. He's terrified. So, like a child that is quieted is my soul. That's what we read. How exactly did the psalmist arrive at this place? So the structure of the first 2 verses, and there's only 3, it's quite short. It's interesting in this regard. The first sounds almost defensive, right? The psalmist lists things he doesn't do. I'm not arrogant. I don't care to worry about your affairs, O God. Instead, according to verse 2, I am an infant, a being of absolute dependence. The very antithesis of all of that. And of course, an infant's terror towards the world doesn't make it any less dependent. It's one and the same. It's an obvious sign of his dependence. And so I asked exactly how the poet arrives at this place, because I think there's an assumption in reading this again, bringing our assumptions to it, that he performed some sort of spiritual practice. He meditated. He breathed deeply. He went for a leisurely walk in nature. Something of this sort. What if, like the disciples caught out in the storm, he calmed his soul by crying out, like any dependent infant would, receiving in turn what it was that he required. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, writing about this psalm, states its message is directly opposed to modernity, with its drive towards independence, self-sufficiency, and autonomy. These values, he believes, are postures of hopelessness, in which free gifts are excluded and one is left to one's own resources. When we think about that in our time and place, this is a radical statement. So much for God helps those who help themselves. Those are the people without hope. Hope begins by realizing our dependence on God. And in my reading, voicing that realization. The one who cries out, be it even in anger or despair, that person hopes. And perhaps her hope might be reflected in Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds. And for everyone who knocks, the door will be opened. We need to cultivate a voice that says it's okay to ask. It's okay to knock. It's okay not to be strong and sure. If we're to arrive at this place of peaceful repose that we read about, this is an essential thing. We must come to an understanding of this. A voice rises within me, saying, hold on, my child. I'll give you strength. I'll give you hope. Just stay a little while. These are the words from the season's anonymous poet in Cologne. For those of us who have heard the poem through this season, recall, though, what precedes this. Sometimes in this suffering and hopeless despair, my heart cries out for shelter, to know someone's there. You might have noticed in your bulletin that today's text was from the Revised Standard Version translation. That is, as opposed to the New Revised Standard Version. This is an intentional choice. Some of the other translations, for whatever reason, treat this child quieted at his mother's breast more ambiguously. And so they sort of obscure that vulnerability and tenderness that we've explored so deeply. And so I think the beautiful language of the translation we heard is a kind of vessel that can transport us to a prayerful space, maybe not unlike this prayer closet. It was this aesthetic sense that drove my selecting it in part. But when you think about it, this is not all that uncommon when it comes to how we use the Psalms. Right? The most prescient example I can think of is Psalm 23, which in times of trial, we almost always read in the King James Version. Because how important is it to hear, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." To hear that versus the contemporary, "Yes, goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will live in the Lord's house as long as I live." There's a difference. We make a choice. That's a valid thing, because it expresses a profound need. We don't know for certain, for example, what happens after forever, but we know, and we can give voice to what we hope for, what we have faith in. And many of the Psalms operate on this level, in which they express similar longing for things hoped for. In that way, they connect us to this question we've been asking this season. What do you most want to be true about God? For the psalm in question, worded as it is, I believe it can help us express our longing to be taken off the treadmill we're stuck on. To be taken off of it and embraced, provided for, and even through our deepest fears and anxieties, comforted. And then by expressing that, by voicing that need, somehow we are comforted. Knock and the door will be open. So hope, Israel. Hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. This is how the psalmist concludes. It appears this line was tacked on at some later date to the original couplet. It happens throughout the Psalms, where you have somebody voicing some level of personal piety, and it gets transformed and reassigned to Israel. But this unexpected shift, literarily, I think is very effective. I sometimes think of how we might stage these texts that we read in church, or how we might film them. Right? So for the first two lines, perhaps you're looking at this person in solitude, wrestling, praying, maybe a close-up of his face. And through his face, you might see him finding peace. Then we might cut to a wide exterior, and you see him emerging with boldness. Having found the value of dependence, he addresses the very society that taught him to go it alone. And having found hope through that, he addresses the very society that taught him hopelessness. For so many more are in need. Who taught you to go it alone? Who taught you to be strong and sure? If you found peace in our word today, I'd encourage you, again, as we do always, to extend that peace to your neighbor who may be in need of it. May it be so. Amen.